Have you ever wondered why some Christian doctrines are put forth as profound mysteries while other are explained crystal clear in logical terms? The difference is not denominational, but the difference is two different profound ways of thinking. Let's explain this. Let's break this down. So, the East and the West have two different ways of processing and dealing with information. Let's go back into the BC era to the Greeks. The Greeks used to like to ponder thought for the joy of pondering, not necessarily to arrive at a conclusion. On the other hand, the Persians like to dwell or dabble in the idea of mystery. So they believe that many things they did not want to completely remove all mystery, because they believed if you did, you could rob it of its potential power. So they like the mysticism and mystery. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia, these two ideas came together and they coalesced in Alexandria, Egypt. Well, what took place was the fact that the two different ways of thought were able to find synthesis in this respects. The Greeks liked to ponder just to ponder. They weren't necessarily trying to arrive at a conclusion. They just wanted to speculate on thought. The Persians didn't want to many times solve all the problems or mysteries. They wanted to leave some things in an air of mystery. So the two different systems did not argue with each other. They found agreement. While on the other hand, in the West, the Romans, they built up their law system. They had more of a legal mind, and to them, a mystery was to be solved. They saw a mystery as a weakness, and they needed to lift any air of ambiguity in any subject. So, and unlike the Greeks who wanted to ponder on different philosophical ideas for the sake of pondering, no other sake, the Romans were not like that. The Romans wanted to, if they picked up a thought and they wanted to think about it, it was to come to a logical conclusion, and believing that mystery was a weakness or a problem to be solved. What they wanted to do is, as they thought through any particular subject, they wanted to logically or syllogistically arrive at a conclusion, lifting mystery all along the way. So then these developed two different ways of thinking. One in the East, which was a coalescing of the Persian and the Greek way of thinking, and then the other was in the West, the Roman way of thinking. Okay, well, these two ideas, they found in the church, the Roman Empire was divided between East and West. Well, the church was also divided between East and West. And we will see these different ideas coming up in different Christian doctrines. So what would take place is, if the East brought up a doctrinal question, they dealt with that doctrinal question, and then they settled that doctrinal question within the East. Usually you will find that it results in being left as an air of mystery with a lot of speculative thought along the way. That being said, also in there, the speculative thought, well, you'll find that not always is these thoughts derived from Scripture. So they're not always derived from Scripture. What happens is you'll find that they will be speculative outside of biblical sources. And at the same time, the Persian influence didn't want to remove all mystery. So you'll see a lot of speculative thought and concluding in a lot of mystery. On the other hand, if the West brought up a doctrine, and then it was dealt with in the West, concluded in the West, then what you'll find typically is that doctrine will be derived from somewhere in Scripture, usually maybe in Genesis or somewhere in that venue or in the beginnings of the New Testament. Then you will find it logically walks through Scripture. And as it does, it's trying to remove ambiguity all along the way and then have a systematic conclusion. So when you look at a doctrine, you usually can tell, even if you don't know the history of that doctrine, you usually can tell where it was brought up and also in what region of the church it was dealt with, either East or West. Let me give you a case study. Okay, so a few case studies here. One, if you'll see the nature of Christ, when the idea is brought up, it's a speculative idea. How many natures does Christ have? Now notice, I'm not refuting any doctrines here. I'm just showing you how they dealt with it. How many natures does Christ have? Does he have one nature? Does he have two natures? See, and this is the Greek way of thinking. A speculative idea just bring up a question. And then there also will words will be used, and at the end of the day, oftentimes it's left in an air of mystery. For example, they'll use words like the hypostatic union or the mutual indwelling. Also, things like theosis, or the idea of being partakers of the divine. How are we partakers of the divine? It's a mystery. You see? All of this is dealt with in the East, concluded in the East. A Western way of thinking, they'll continually question it and saying, it doesn't make sense. I can't understand it. And this is often why when people think on the Trinity, they'll say, I'm confused. It doesn't quite make sense. It's not quite clear. Well, that was by design, is because the Persian way of thinking doesn't want to completely lift all mystery, because to the Persian way of thinking, that in dealing with God, there's a transcendent power. And if you remove all mystery, then you subtract from the potential transcendent power of the divine, and you're taking out of it a certain quality that humanity can receive from the divine, and they receive it through the mystery. You see, that's their thought. So then it's intentional to have an ambiguity when you're all said and done. But again, in the same venue, the West would be just the opposite. So for example, let's look at a doctrine of sin. Well, the doctrine of sin was dealt with in the West, dealt with by Augustine in the West. And so that doctrine within the church of original sin, it has a logical framework, and it's a legal, logical framework that follows a certain order for example, that you can follow it is the idea is derived from Scripture. The original thought will be that Adam sinned, and through his sin, all of his descendants carried that sin of Adam. He passed it on, so that we were all born in sin. They know you Scripture. We were all born in sin. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There are none righteous, no, not one. You'll see Scriptures all along the way verifying the claims made. And it's in a syllogistic fashion along the way. So then what happens is then the idea will be next, well, then if every man has sin, then he needs to be justified before God, and he can't be justified before God. So then there has to arrive at a penal substitution, where in the death of a righteous pays the penalty that the guilty can't pay. So then Christ died for the sins of the world, a righteous for the unrighteous, and the gift of Christ's righteousness is transferred to the unrighteous by faith. So then there'll be a scripture that'll be applied again. By faith are you saved through grace, that not of yourself, lest any man should boast. You see? And then it's ordered in a logical fashion. Then we become justified before God, not because we were just, but because he was just, the sinless one, the penal substitution, which was Christ. Then we become just in the eyes of God. Now we can ask what we will, and we can have a right standing before God because our debt was paid, and it was paid in full. There's no air of ambiguity in there. We logically understand what the doctrine is and what the church is trying to put forth as the solution. Well, you can tell that this arrived in the West, or I say arrived or derived. The question came up in the West. The question was dealt with in the West, and the question was settled in the West. So even if you have a Western church and they hold a doctrine that seems to hold an air of mystery, you can pretty much conclude that they originally received that doctrine from the East. And even to this day, like, for example, I'll use a case study where the East and the West differ greatly on a particular doctrine, and how this doctrine is a perfect case study of mysticism and logical thought. For example, let's pick up the communion. Okay, so the Eastern conclusion of the communion is both picking up the same doctrine. The Eastern conclusion of the communion is the bread and wine are literally the body and the blood of the Lord. Then the question is, how are they the body and blood of the Lord? It looks like bread, it looks like wine. Oh, it's a mystery, but it is. But how? It can't be explained. But Christ is physically present in the bread and the wine, even though it doesn't appear so. It's a great mystery of the church. It's a great mystery of the communion of their Mass. Well, when the West picked that up, the West dealt with that same doctrine, and the West said, well, no, the communion is the representation of the body and the blood. Christ is not physically there. It's physically bread and it is physically wine. It's a representation of Christ's sacrifice, of the penal substitution that was offered. It's a representation of that substitution. And we partake of the Mass or the communion as in a remembrance and showing forth to the world of the sacrifice that Christ paid. See, the one is a mystery, and the other, there's no mystery at all. These are by design. It's two different ways of thinking. And then if you look, for example, Luther picked that up, and because he was one of the first ones in the Reformation, excuse me, one of the first ones in the Reformation, well, he straddled the in-between an Eastern thought and a Western thought. And so then what Luther concluded, that it's a sacramental union, and it's not physically the body and the blood of the Lord. The bread and the wine are physically bread and wine, yet Christ is mysteriously present in the service. And so then there's the air of mystery, while yet trying to explain logically that the bread is still bread and the wine is still wine. See, so he stood right between and tried to grab elements from Eastern thought and yet have a logical conclusion as in Western thought. Now, I'm not here trying to point out one way is different from the other, but I'm just trying to explain here, or not different, but one is more right than the other. But I'm just trying to explain the two different thoughts. Now, to me, I want everything to make sense. So any doctrine that I have, I want it to follow a logical thought, and at the end, have no air of mystery. That's the way my mind runs. That's the way I'm made up. To me, that's the only way that makes sense. I know that there's not all Christian doctrines are settled in that manner. But if you're wondering, why is it that some doctrines look some way and other doctrines look starkly different? Well, it's because of the two different ways of intellectual thought and ways of dealing with doctrine. The idea, the principles are even much older than Christianity. So until next time, try to make a guess when you look at a doctrine and you see that whether there's an air of mystery to it or there's no air of mystery at all. Whether in the doctrine there's a lot of speculative pondering, or are there in this doctrine a lot of concrete conclusions? And then test yourself. When you look at that doctrine, ask yourself, was this handled in the West or the East? Was it solved in Eastern councils? Or was it solved in Western schoolrooms? Look at it and then test yourself, come to a conclusion, and then go back and try to look at the history of that doctrine. See if you're right. Till next time.